So Rabbi Glinken mentioned in his presentation the divide between Orthodox and conservative Judaism as an important element of the Agunot debate in the conservative movement. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And certainly scholars will point to the Agunot issue as a boundary marker that helped to differentiate between Orthodox and conservative Judaism. Simply put, conservative rabbis proved more willing than Orthodox rabbis to deal with the question. They proposed solutions. Orthodox rabbis rebelled, thus furthering the divide between Orthodox and conservative Judaism. This is an argument that's been featured in a number of dissertations, perhaps most prominently by Regina Stein in 1998. A dissertation never published, but nonetheless very influential. I want to argue today that it's important not to overemphasize the centrality of interdenominational debates. Public debate between denominations can shroud internal debates in the conservative movement that in fact were very formative. And Rabbi Glinken actually mentioned this briefly. I just want to draw out the theme a bit more. So the story of Louis Epstein's efforts to aid Agunot might seem like a really odd place to present this argument, right? I mean, the effect of Orthodox polemics against Epstein cannot be underestimated in the discussion about the Epstein proposal in 1935. I do not deny that the Agudat Rabbanim tried to use the proposal to drive a wedge between the Orthodox and conservative movements. So like Rabbi Glinken, I will begin with Epstein, but I want to focus on the developments after his death in 1949. So my aim is to probe Epstein's legacy in the conservative movement. And I think that probing that legacy, the best way to do it, the best window, is through developments within the conservative movement itself. So I gave you, does everyone have a handout? OK, so the first side of the handout is a timeline. And I guess there are a couple of points I want to make. The first point, just by, if you glance at it, you'll realize the Epstein proposal was extremely formative for conservative rabbis, and they dealt with it on a very consistent basis from 1935, when it was first initially proposed, until even into the 1950s. Now, people have talked about it in the initial years, but I want to focus on the years after his death. And in particular, I think the real watershed moment was the advent of a Lieberman Clause in 1954. So, because in 1954, already there was a 20-year history of the conservative movement grappling with the Agunot issue. Anyone who wanted to talk about it had to go through Epstein, and indeed, both rabbis pro and against the Lieberman Clause appealed to Epstein's legacy in their discussion about the Lieberman Clause solution. So let me first give you a quote from a rabbi who was opposed to the Lieberman Clause, Rabbi Aaron Blumenthal. So he writes, "It has been years now." He actually speaks this, these are minutes. "It has been years now. I think Dr. Epstein of blessed memory gave his life to try and find a solution to the problem of the Agunot. This is what we are here for. And it isn't only because we are interested in one particular issue, as Rabbi Glinken has spoken to already. I think, gentlemen, that our approach to the problem of the Agunot is an index of our seriousness and our determination to make Jewish law relevant. If we cannot find within ourselves, once and for all, the confidence to grapple with Egun realistically, then in my humble judgment, we are not really tackling the problem." And you see that there are resonances of this. Rabbi Glinken spoke to Theodore Friedman, who had that quote about how this wasn't just about the Agunot that they were dealing with. Fine. So that's a position against the Lieberman Clause. But there were also rabbis who were in favor, and some of them did appeal to Epstein. So Rabbi Ben-Zion Boxer had a more conciliatory perspective. He writes, or he says, "I think that without the work of Dr. Epstein, what we are doing today could not have been accomplished. Every previous effort that has been made has been a step leading towards the present resolution of the Lieberman Clause. And by adopting it with courage and with faith in each other, let us go forward and write a new chapter in our movement." And the minutes at this point record applause from other rabbis in the room. And in fact, there was also applause to Aaron Blumenthal's proposal as well. So if we just think about these two different quotes, one sees the Lieberman Clause, or Boxer sees the Lieberman Clause as the pinnacle. Everything before is leading up to this moment. On the other hand, Aaron Blumenthal sees this as a definite decline. And why does he see it as a decline? He sees it as a decline because he believed that this was simply a proposal pushed on the conservative movement by Louis Finkelstein, by Saul Lieberman, who, by the way, did not write the Lieberman Clause, but his imprimatur gave it authority. And yes, Louis Finkelstein ran this through the Rabbinical Assembly, and it created a lot of resentment. So Yes, both sides are appealing to Epstein's legacy, but both are actually charting new paths. For advocates of a Lieberman Clause in 1954, they sought to establish a Beit-Din that would enforce the provisions of a Lieberman Clause. They were clearly moving towards a new paradigm of helping Agunot. Meanwhile, those opposed to the Lieberman Clause appealed again to Epstein, but they did so in a way that actually reframed his legacy. A gap emerged between the substance of Epstein's plan and what it had come to symbolize, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment. Indeed, by this time, the division between the two groups was bigger than the text of Epstein's proposal. It had more to do with the way the Agunot problem was understood. Those who favored the Lieberman Clause argued that aiding Agunot did not necessitate change to halakha. The real problem, as Rabbi Lincoln has spoken to, was the circumstances of modernity and particular religious freedom in America. Right? Halakha is meant to be enforced, or it sees itself as something that can be enforced. But with religious freedom, you can't really enforce the halakha, so what do? So Louis Finkelstein is the mastermind behind this new proposal, and he states the following. As Jews in America today, our weakness is that we are a tiny minority in a country which does not recognize our laws. While our Jewish laws are based on the theory that they are enforceable in practice, we have no institutions or instruments for enforcement. Until now, all we could do was plead for voluntary compliance with our laws. Now, champions of the Epstein approach took the opposite position. The problem, they argued, went beyond aiding individual Agunot. What did it mean that halakha for 2,000 years allowed for Agunot? That it sort of colluded with patriarchy, if I can go that far. That it colluded with forces that would subordinate women for so long. They wanted to uproot the problem. They wanted to go after the halakha itself. In this regard, issues of egalitarianism and rabbinic authority took center stage. And Ira Eisenstein, who was later a prominent founder of Reconstructionist Judaism and the son-in-law of Mordechai Kaplan, states the following. We are still operating under the about the Lieberman Clause. We are still operating under the orthodox assumption that the basic inequality of women must be preserved in the law. We have observed in our own country and in others the struggle to emancipate the woman from the domination of the man in political and social life. Yet now that it has become a long struggle, and it is not over yet, most of us truly believe that an injustice is done when women are denied the right to initiate divorce, or when they are doomed to loneliness by the refusal of the husband to grant the divorce. The clause fails to touch upon this fundamental question. And I think that the implications of Eisenstein's argument are actually quite radical when you think about it. The halakha does not perceive itself as egalitarian. Right? The Torah is not an egalitarian text. So what are we doing when we're just making these sort of piecemeal proposals? So the Lieberman Clause split conservative rabbis who aimed to assist Agunot into disparate camps. Those who favored the Lieberman Clause wanted to use it to aid individual Agunot in specific cases. Those who fought against the Lieberman Clause wanted to dig deeper. Each faction found the approach of the other to be misguided and unjust. So I want to begin with the proponents of the Lieberman Clause. Ultimately, the Beit-Din that was envisioned to enforce the provisions of the Lieberman Clause was never created, but a steering committee formed. And what did that steering committee do? It effectively solved over 100 cases involving Agunot. Individual cases were solved. Not all of them involved the Lieberman Clause, but those that did were easier to enforce. And we know this because some of these cases were printed in conservative Judaism after the circumstances of the cases. You can read them. And the process accelerated in 1959. Rabbi Morton Leifman was appointed secretary of the committee. To him befell the responsibility to procure gets from uncooperative husbands. He became a globetrotter for the cause of Agunot. Now, I had the opportunity to meet with Rabbi Leifman in the last years of his life. And while he wasn't fully there, I would say, the one thing that he told me about his time at JTS, one of the two things he told me, was A, that Rabbi Lieberman was more difficult than you might have expected even, and two, that he did all of this Agunot activism. And I thought he was kind of crazy. He's saying, I went to Australia to get a husband to give his wife a divorce. I went to Puerto Rico. I planned my vacations around where I had to go to give wives divorce. I thought this was, okay, maybe this is just a trope, maybe just saying it, he's hyperbolizing. But then I found the minutes. February 11th, 1963, Rabbi Leifman gave the committee an insight into some of the patterns involved in terms of distance and interest, solving a case in Australia, Puerto Rico, arranging for a get involving one partner in St. Louis and another in Chicago, bickering over trifles and some strange and sad byproducts of attempts to procure Gittin. And he told me a couple of interesting stories, which I'll skip now for purposes of time, going to prisons, etc. So he really put his entire effort into it. A man who had signed a ketubah with the Lieberman clause inside it could expect to get the following letter. If you turn the page around, maybe you already have, you'll see a letter that Morton Leifman sent to an actual person. I've redacted the name. But what's interesting is that when I probed the son of this person is actually now a marriage counselor in New York City. So go whatever that means. But the point here is that I'll read parts of the letter. It says, the National Beit Din of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America and the Rabbinical Assembly was requested by Mrs. G to convene a court session to discuss her request for a Jewish divorce. And just to read, the underlined portion is actually underlined in the text itself. We are holding a court session on Thursday afternoon, December 20th, 1966, in room 301 in the Teachers Institute building, etc., etc. This is an arraignment. And that was what it was intended, to scare a husband to give a divorce. Now, I just want to quickly go to the advocates of the Epstein proposal for purposes of time. So Leifman's activism did nothing to sway those who were against the Lieberman clause. They thought it was ridiculous that he had to go all the way to Australia to deal with the problem. So in 1957, some of these rabbis appealed to the Conservative Committee on Jewish Law and Standards to deal with the problem by using Epstein's approach. And 2 years later, the Rabbinical Assembly, just one more minute, the Rabbinical Assembly comes back and says, we looked at this proposal for 2 years. It's just not elegant enough. People thought the Lieberman clause wasn't good. Actually, the Epstein clause isn't good either, because it's not a systemic solution. And there I think we really see the disjuncture between what the Epstein clause said and what it had come to symbolize in the years after his death. It said a proposal, right, minui shlichut, allows a woman to get a divorce on her own accord, but it doesn't really do the systemic work. It still requires waiting time. It's messy. It's too messy. So just to conclude, Epstein's proposal was never implemented, to be sure, but neither was it totally defeated. 1959 is best understood as the year Epstein's proposal became part of the heritage of the conservative movement. Never again would the RA rabbis resolve to implement its provisions or re-examine its technicalities in an official capacity. Still, it would be remembered in the ensuing years as a starting point, a window that, when opened, revealed to the conservative rabbis the power they held to embark on a journey to remake halakha, one that continues to the present day. Whether or not Epstein would have recognized himself in these changes is certainly another matter, but such was the long legacy of his activism. Thank you.